Hi, and welcome to this review of the March 2020 Advanced Financial Management exam. My name's Andrew Mower and I'm a tutor at Kaplan Financial. So during the session, we're going to look at some AFM exam technique and how to approach the exam. We're going to look at an overview of the March 2020 exam. We're then going to focus in on question 1 and try and put some of that exam technique into practice. And then we'll do a little wrap up with a summary of the key things you need to remember ahead of your exam. So let's just have a little reminder about this exam. You've got 3 hours 15 minutes to complete it, and that's working out at 1.95 minutes per mark. So always useful that to allocate time to each question, just to make sure you're not overrunning. Do remember as well now that all 3 questions are compulsory. Previously in this exam you used to have a choice in section B. Now you have to do all 3 questions, which takes away any decisions that you might have to make. So in some ways makes life a little bit easier for you. In terms of some examiner tips for this paper, make sure that you're always applying your knowledge to the scenario. You're not just what we call learning and churning. You're not just remembering things and then reciting them into your answer. You really need to try and tailor your answer to the question that's been asked of you. And a good way to do that is making sure you read the scenario carefully, you pick up the key points, make reference to the company, make reference to the scenario and what's happening, and bring those into your answer and make it a really tailored and applied answer. Make sure you practice your time management. One of the big issues in this exam is people spending too long on certain parts of questions. So be really strict with that 1.95 minutes per mark. And make sure you read the question carefully. You want to be answering the question that's been set, not the question that you wish had been set. So make sure you read it, because sometimes just misreading a little word or interpreting it slightly incorrectly can veer you off in a really dangerous direction. So make sure you're reading that question carefully. Make sure that your layout is really good in this exam. It's so important. If you make it nice to mark, you'll score more marks. So you need to lay out your numerical workings really clearly. Show your workings. If you are referencing separate workings, for example, working 1, working 2, make sure you then put them in a logical place and label them up so they're easy to find for the markers. You also want to make sure that you're being succinct, but also maintaining a professional tone when you're writing this exam. So they don't want bullet points, they don't want lists of things. They want you to be writing short, well-structured paragraphs and sentences that have a professional tone to them. You also will see that you'll get 4 professional marks in section A of this paper. And this usually takes the format of a report. So if they ask you to do a report, you need to do a title. So just a really quick summary of what the report is about. An introductory paragraph, not much in that at all, so probably 2 or 3 lines, just outlining what the report covers. Then you do your report as you usually would answer a question. Make sure you have time to do a conclusion at the end as well. So wrap up your findings. Should they, shouldn't they do this project? Should they, shouldn't they invest in this company, or whatever it might be? And then you probably want to show your workings in a separate appendix. Now, traditionally, an appendix comes at the end of a report. So all your calculations you'll label at the end of that. Personally, I don't mind that being up front if it means then that you can refer back to the numbers. It just saves you having to leave several pages before you guess where you're going to put your numbers. But either way, make sure your numbers are in an appendix. So any calculations you do them in a separate section. Let's think about the March 2020 exam now. So as always with AFM, we had 3 questions. Question 1, the 50 marker, was all about an acquisition. And in there we saw the report format. And that's the one we're going to go into a little bit more detail in a few moments. Question 2 was a risk management or hedging question that was fairly tricky. There were elements of it where there were some easy marks to get. But then there was the section on margins, which a lot of students struggled with. So definitely worth looking over that question at some point. But again, always remember there will be plenty of achievable marks in this exam. You just need to make sure you're focusing on those ones. There are always going to be some hard ones. You just need to make sure you're getting those easy marks in the bag before you start chasing those really tricky marks. Question 3 was about investment appraisal. Again, relatively tricky, but I had a few nice bits to it. So make sure you review that investment appraisal one, which was question 3. Now, as I mentioned, we're going to focus on question 1 from this exam. And within this question, it was split into 3 parts, A, B, and C. Part A was all about behavioural factors. Part B was a report on an acquisition. And part C was how we then finance this offer. I've just put on the screen there the number of marks available for each part, and then the corresponding time as well, if we're basing it on 1.95 minutes per mark. Again, make sure in the exam that you're being really strict with your timings and you're not overrunning on any particular bits, because it's so easy to do this in the exam. Another good bit of technique to use here is you can answer these in any order. So if you look at this and you think actually financing the offer is quite a nice 8 marks, which I think actually it probably was, I'd be looking to maybe even do that first. So before I get stuck into a 36 mark bit, I might look at that and go, part C, okay, how do we finance this cash offer? As long as it doesn't rely on anything that you've done before it, yeah, you could always do that first. It's a good way to get your confidence up if you're looking at the other parts and thinking that they're a bit harder. What you don't want to do is run out of time on something that you know. And there's nothing more frustrating than finding that you've run out of time and you had so much more to give. So just think about that in the exam. Just think, right, what is the best order for me to tackle this question in? And it may well be that you do one of these sort of smaller parts first, just to get those marks in the bag. What we're going to do now then is have a look at this paper and dig into it in a bit more detail. So here are the requirements for question 1 on the left. You had just under 2 sides of scenario to read before you got to these requirements, but it's always a really good idea to read the requirements first to understand what they want you to do before you then read all the detail in the scenario. So in this question you had the section on behavioural factors, which they said may lead to this business being valued too highly. So that was our first part. So I've just set that up in my answer box here. To save you having to read my terrible handwriting, I'm just doing this on a word processor, just so you can hopefully make it a little bit more legible for you. We then had this report. So it was this report to the board. So here they asked you to do various bits. Quite common in advanced FM that the first few parts of the report are the numbers. So it was comparing this additional value. Then it was calculating the WACC, and then it was estimating the total value they'll gain. So the first 3 parts there would work really nicely in an appendix. Then the 4th part is then the sort of more discursive bit, which forms the main bit of the report. And here are your professional marks. So you've got those 4 professional marks, which as long as you stick to the title, introduction, report, appendix, conclusion, type format, will be absolutely fine. And then at the end there we had these factors about how they were going to finance the offer, and talking about a little bit of gearing in there as well. So we had that was the final bit in part C. So just to give you a few ideas about this question and how to structure it, a bit of technique, you need to go away and look at this question in detail and work through it and have a look at the suggested answers as well. They're really useful. These behavioural factors then, so it was about why this tech company was potentially valued too high, so why it was being valued highly. Now they did ask for behavioural factors. A lot of students went down the route of coming up with techniques of valuing companies and sort of going down that route, but it wasn't about that. It was about what behavioural factors would do that. So why might people value it too highly? And there were a few bits that you could have talked about in here. So there were things like herd instinct you could have mentioned. You could have talked about this idea of confirmation bias. The fact it's quite a fashionable industry, this sort of tech industry, people might get a little bit carried away with it. You could have talked about that. Because it's for sale, there's likely to be a lot of positive information in there, so you could have mentioned this one. The fact that they've put out an asking price might influence people's judgment. Just because that number's been floated, they might be potentially slightly more influenced by that. So you've got lots of ideas there, lots of things you could have talked about, and they were offering you 1 to 2 marks per point there. So you could have easily, you only needed potentially 3 things there in terms of behavioural factors. So make sure you've revised that, looked at the various terms, but hopefully a few things you could have said in there. And the way to structure it, remember, you'd be looking for small, concise paragraphs. So short, concise paragraphs for each separate idea. So for each separate thing you have, for every different idea you have, you just want a little short, concise paragraph that outlines that. Makes it a lot easier to mark. And make sure as well that you apply your answers to the scenario. So rather than just talking in really general terms about herd instinct and people follow each other, if one person does something, other people follow. Yeah, apply it to our scenario and say, if people are investing in this tech company we see news spreading and the share price rising, people are then more likely to invest or whatever it might be. So yeah, you can then try and link it back into that a bit better. Let's think about part B now then, which was the report. So I've just pre-populated this with the structure of a report. So probably not a bad idea in the exam just to get this jotted down somewhere so you know the structure that you need to follow. So because it is a report, we're going to do a title. So a really quick, just a few words, just outlining what the report is about. So I'll just quickly jot that down. So summary of the requirement, what they're asking you to do. So something investigating the potential acquisition or whatever it might be. You've then got an introduction, so just outlining what this report looks at. And all you're really doing there is just summarising what they want you to do in these requirements. So just, I'd say 2 to 3 lines probably, overview of the requirements, so what they want you to do. So really quick. Something the examiner said in the examiner report was that people are wasting time writing really wordy introductions. You just need a really quick overview of what they're looking for you to do. So yeah, don't spend ages on that. There's a really nice one of those in the model answer, so you can have a look at that. You've got your report then, so this is sort of the main body of your report. So this is sort of your the wordy bit. So this is the wordy section of the report. So that's where the majority of this is, the words are going to sit. Now in this bit, the only wordy bit really is actually this part 4 there. So if I just highlight that there, so that's going to be so B part 4 is where you're going to put that in there. So you'd want to label it. It's a little bit strange, isn't it? Because you're trying to do a report, but you're also doing an exam at the same time. So you still need to make it easy to mark. So that's where you'd want to put, so B part 4 would go in there. So that's your report. Still make sure you're using subheadings and other bits in there. And actually what was really important in this particular exam was about, they said here, they gave you, they asked you to assess the strategic and financial value. So you've got strategic and financial value of the acquisition, including a discussion of the estimations and assumptions made. Now, they love assumptions questions in AFM and estimations, discussing what you've done. And I think they're quite nice. I think they're quite a good way to pick up a few marks. But they're actually asking you to do 4 little bits in there. So there's strategic and financial value. There was then estimations and assumptions made. So I'd use those as subheadings. So I'd say I'd use strategic value, just to make sure you are covering them all off. I'd then have financial value. I then have estimations and assumptions. So I would have all of those as however you want to structure it. There's little subheadings within that just to make sure I'm ticking off exactly what they want me to talk about. And the way it worked, actually, the mark scheme then was broken down into these bits. So it's 3 to 4 marks for there. So these are the number of marks available for each bit. The financial value was 2 to 3 marks. You then had 3 to 4 for your estimations, and you had 3 to 4 for your assumptions as well. So the mark scheme very much mirrored the question in that it was broken down into these 4 little bits. And as I said, you probably just want to label that this is the section that you're answering. So yeah, use the questions to your advantage. Break up that. If you make this question rather than 12 marks, which is potentially a bit intimidating, make it 4 smaller sections. I think that question becomes easier. And again, in the examiner report, it said a lot of people didn't address all of those issues. So a few people just focused on a couple of them. So that you're throwing away potentially, if you didn't answer those 2, you're potentially throwing away 8 marks there, which I think are quite nice. I think they're quite achievable. So make sure you've got that. Now I filled this in just because it was sort of the next bit of the report. Realistically, I think you probably would have done your numbers first. So you probably would have done parts 1, 2, and 3 first, because then you have something to talk about. So you probably want to come back to that. But I just wanted to show you that's how you can break that question down and make it a little bit easier. Your conclusion, again, just 2 to 3 lines, just summarising what the report findings were. Give your opinion, so make sure you do that. Then the appendix, this is where the majority of the marks were coming in this question. So this is where you'll then put your B parts. So we'll have our B parts 1, so parts I, and I. So you put them into there. Again, you'd want to separate those out. So you had your 4 marks for the additional value, which I think most people did quite well on. You had your whack there. Just make sure with that whack, you might want to just look over that and just check that you're okay with your de-gearing and re-gearing. So there was a little bit of that in there, which hopefully you can remember from FM, but if you can't, you need to go back and revise it. So just make sure you're okay with all that stuff. And then there was this estimation of the total value they'll gain, which again I think was hopefully not too bad. I think most students coped relatively well with that. So the calculation element of this, hopefully not too bad. So do your numbers in the appendix, and then you've got all of those in there. You've got your main report going on just in this bit. And then you've got your little conclusion there as well. So that's the sort of structure you're looking for with a report such as this one. Finally, we have part C, which was about how to finance this offer. And I think a few people missed the fact that this was going to be a cash offer. So people going down the route of talking about share for share exchange and so on, which was going down the wrong path really. So this was actually a really nice part of the question. If you understood what they were asking, I think there were lots of things that you could have brought into this answer. They were giving you 1 to 2 marks per point again. So very similar to part A in that you want lots of short, concise paragraphs. So short, concise paragraphs explaining each idea. And making sure, again, that you're applying it to this particular scenario. And again, acknowledging the fact that it is a cash offer is a good way to do that. Now, loads of ideas you could have had here. We could have brought the pecking order theory into this. You could talk about the security of the particular way of financing it. You could talk about tax relief, what the industry sort of normal behaviour is in terms of what type of finance they're getting on that. The attitude to debt within the company, you can mention that. We could talk about director preferences, cash flows, covenants, how available the finance is. Loads of different factors that they could have. So I actually think this was probably the easiest bit of the whole question, this part. So again, maybe not a bad idea at all to do this at the beginning. Okay, just to wrap up then, some key advice for this exam. Make sure you're reading those questions really carefully and going through that scenario, understanding it, and bringing that scenario into your answers, applying your knowledge to the scenario. Make all your answers really neat, make your workings easy to follow, make your calculations nice and tidy. And one of the most important things is making sure your time management is good. And a great way to do that is to keep practicing exam standard questions to time. look at past exams, do them to time, be strict, and keep practicing. Thank you for watching, and good luck with your exam.